The story of the lone man trying to save the Express has become part of the legend of the Tangiwai disaster, and the name of Cyril Ellis dominated the events of Christmas Eve. Driving north that night, Ellis couldn't get over the road bridge, which had been destroyed by the lahar. The story goes he saw the light of the approaching express and ran to the tracks into the path of the train. But despite the warning, the driver didn't see him. But timing casts doubt on the Ellis legend. From the railway crossing where he first saw the train to Tangiwai Bridge is only a kilometre. Just a minute's travel for an express train. Only a minute to perform an astonishing human feat. For Ellis had just a minute to run 80 yards, scale 2 fences, climb an embankment in the dark, then dash down the tracks into the path of the speeding express. It was impossible for Ellis to have reached the tracks in time, as the legend has it, to try to warn the driver. But it seems most likely that he reached the line after the braking engine and front carriages had gone past and into the river. What we do know is that he climbed aboard Car Z that had stopped briefly before it too toppled into the river. Along with the passenger John Holman and the guard Bill Ingalls, we also know that Ellis helped save many lives.
A lot of people doubt that Cyril Ellis did what he was claimed to have done, but he went across there. He tried to stop that train.
It was, I think, generally discounted that this man had done what he said he had done.
He finished up in the carriage, went down with it. He played a huge part in getting them all out of it. I'm pretty sure he was the last one out of the carriage.
But he certainly told us to get out, but we didn't have any chance to get out, and he didn't even have any chance to get off. So he went down with the carriage. He
came over to the fire that we got lit. He was stripped to the waist, and he was hyped up, and but he was the intrepid hero that night, in my opinion.
But to understand what really happened at Tangiwai, it's necessary to remove Ellis from the limelight. In fact, evidence shows driver Parker hit the brakes 700 feet before the bridge, but not because of Ellis. Evelyn Munster, safe near the back of the train, gives us a vital clue as to why the driver applied the brakes and in so doing saved the lives of 134 passengers.
And that's the way I described it, as being on a peninsula around there with water on either side.
Analysing the information and talking to survivors, we can now create a picture of what the driver saw. Finally, we understand why Parker braked the train. Not because of Ellis. Ellis wasn't there. Ellis couldn't have been there. That was impossible. Parker saw the lahar, not ahead, but beside him, as if driving on a peninsula. But live heroes are a useful diversion, it seems, and the truth of that night somehow eluded the Board of Inquiry. It now seems so obvious. Because of his quick reactions and because he wasn't speeding, driver Charlie Parker was able to save the last half of his train. An examination of the controls showed the crew cut the oil supply and sanded the tracks to help the braked wheels grip the tracks in a desperate attempt to stop the train. Charles Parker, the real hero of Tangiwai, finally emerges.
The brake pedestal here had sort of jammed up against in here. The oil lever had been shut off.
Yeah, we actually saw sanding on the lines, you know, where someone had applied sand to the rails.
I know that he wouldn't dare go over the speed limit or do anything like that.
He'd have probably been going along there at around about 50 mile an hour. Other drivers there would have been doing 60, 70 mile an hour.
My father, being so cautious, probably the people in the first class carriages and even some in the second class would have owed their lives to what he did on that particular night, and probably didn't receive the recognition that he probably should have.
Yet all the frantic efforts of the heroic driver had been futile. Tangiwai was already a weakened bridge from 1925, badly positioned, a disaster waiting to happen, and totally unable to withstand another large assault from Ruapehu, a bridge which would be at the centre of a cover-up at the inquiry into the disaster. The Board of Inquiry into the Tangiwai disaster sat in March 1954, 2 months after the tragedy. Lineup of council was high-powered, including a future Governor-General. And as with all bureaucratic procedures of the era, engaged an army of secretaries and typists. In the 6 weeks that it sat, the board interviewed and cross-examined 58 witnesses, examined 74 exhibits, and the half-ton of paperwork went to produce a report totaling nearly 1,400 pages. Because of its small population at the time, virtually everybody in New Zealand was affected by the Tangiwai disaster and either knew of or were related to a passenger on doomed Express 626. So reports of the day-to-day news of the Board of Inquiry were followed with interest.
The civil engineers were the principal rail witnesses at the inquiry. It was a suggestion that the bridge had not been soundly constructed, that the piers had not been properly founded because of expedients said to have been introduced by F.W. Firkett, who was in charge of the completion of that section of the main trunk railway.
The construction of the main trunk line across the volcanic plateau with its high viaducts was a wonder of the pioneering age, although engineers didn't seem to be concerned that for 40 miles the railway ran close to 2 active volcanoes. An expert of his time, William Rankin, advised that where floods could be expected, the land should be crossed by viaducts and warned against earth embankments. But he was ignored. This section of line at Tangiwai broke all the rules, and incredibly Transrail still uses the same route today. When a big lahar hits, this embankment acts as a dam, trapping water and debris, and to make matters worse, the bridge crosses the river on a sharp bend at the far end of the floodplain. Tangiwai Bridge was, and still is, a sitting target for the next lahar. In 1925, a lahar came down the Whangaehu, moving pier number 4 half an inch off centre. This photo of Tangiwai Bridge, unknown to the inquiry of the day, was taken a few months before the disaster and reveals only makeshift repairs to Pier 4. For years, engine crews reported a slight sideways kick as they passed over the bridge. From that day on, the Tangiwai disaster was waiting to happen because Pier number 4 had been scoured or washed out under its base.
Let's have a look at our selection of Tangiwai piers.
It's all kept.
Phil Holmes is a respected civil engineer with a wide knowledge of bridges.
I think it's very likely that the scour was a major influence at this pier. We had a large volume of water coming down the river at high velocity. Water forces would have bowled the pier over when there was no longer any support from the ground. It would have possibly broken off at a construction joint and then been simply bowled over downstream.
We can now demonstrate for the first time what probably happened at Tangiwai. Scoured and sitting like a loose tooth in the riverbed, Pier 4 is the only pier to be taken out by the lahar. The railways would argue the bridge failed against an overwhelming onslaught, but that was not true. The 1953 lahar was not big enough to take out the whole bridge, despite its faults. Apart from scoured Pier 4, which was flung 40 yards downstream, the rest of it held, only collapsing like a pack of cards under the weight of the train. For railways engineers, the scouring of Pier 4 was a subject to be played down. Had it held, the express might have got across and there would have been no Tangiwai disaster. At the Board of Inquiry, New Zealand railway engineers remained intransigent against cross-examination over the failure of Bridge 136 at Tangiwai. The heat was turned on them over the crucial question, was the accident foreseeable? And if Pier number 4 had been scoured and not sufficiently firmly embedded, then there could be a finding of negligence and compensation. Their replies to key questions were evasive. Could the railways have taken more notice of warnings? The 1925 lahar? A 9-foot rise in the river and no rain? No, you say we received warnings. I don't know that we did. Were not the bridge foundations totally inadequate? Well, I do not agree with you. In this age before television news, Newspaper headlines reporting the inquiry began to cast a shadow beyond reasonable doubt. The railway's case was, however, straightforward. The Tangiwai disaster had been an act of God and unforeseeable. They did not seem to take the body of evidence seriously and dug their toes in. At the inquiry, independent engineers were critical of the railways. One engineer expressed a common view. The weight of evidence presented indicates that scour caused the failure of the railway bridge. Scour has been known and recognised by engineers as a problem for a long time, and it's striking that during the inquiry there's been no real and original discussion of the problem by the department's engineers. But all the damning evidence showing there was a case of negligence against the railway engineers going back to 1925, when the damage was first done to Pier 4, was to be ignored by the Board of Inquiry. And there was to be even more compelling evidence that would be ignored about the mountain.